Dobrý deň všetkým.
Hello, good morning everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's my big honor to have the opportunity to approach the experts who focus on this discipline for a number of years. Frankly said, I am a stranger. I am an architecture historian. So I'm not a protectionist or but I believe that I am an activist member of this society. On Thursday, 20th of January 2022, that is this winter, the development company Imocap, owner of the former House of Trade Unions, Technology and Culture in Bratislava, began demolition of the main building with its Congress Hall, theater, cinema, and other social spaces. This iconoclastic act took place despite the fact that the building was a landmark of the city and the Bratislava Nové Mesto district, and at the same time the object of the assessment of the initiative to declare the work of a national cultural monument. It's true that the Monument Office of the Slovak Republic was already dealing with the initiative submitted by the Slovak Docomomo working group in April 2019, which was then in its third year. The unsuccessful effort for the monument protection and the destruction of its important part of the architectural heritage illustrate in a concentrated form several problems of the protection of late modernism architecture in Slovakia, such as inability to accept this architecture as a fully fledged part of the historical heritage on the part of the monument of the community, the limited ability of the public administration to face pressure of property owners, but above all, the general attitude of social elites in relation to the heritage of welfare state. These problems are fully manifested in case of building for culture. The former regime carried out in abundance throughout Slovakia the houses of culture as generators of socialist social life and instruments for the promotion of official culture had a special status, and special attention was paid to their construction. This meant situating such buildings in prominent places in the centers of settlements, increased demands on their architectural form, and higher investment costs. The circumstances that favored such investments at the time of their creation often turned into a handicap after 1989. The authoritarian regime of socialist Czechoslovakia invested considerable resources in the construction of facilities for the dissemination of official culture and education in every major settlement, as well as in smaller villages. Facilities for public cultural, social and educational events sprang up in the second half of the 20th century, despite the fact that they were a tool for promoting the ideology of the regime. Cultural centers and education centers cannot be denied as a merit of disseminating culture and building civil society in the broadest sense of the word. In addition to all the ideologically committed theatrical performances, concerts, exhibitions and lectures, classical music and theater, popular culture and general education also penetrated the population through them. Each cultural center thus simultaneously contributed to the strengthening of the local community, the creation of new social bonds, and thus the cultivation of society and creation of its culture. From the point of view of construction, the most productive period was the period from the early 60s to the mid-1980s, when the modernist idea of architecture and urbanism was fully realized in Slovakia. In those years, the greatest and, from the architectural point of view, the most remarkable works were created. The first decade is characterized by the construction of urban cultural and social centers in abstract forms of the international style. They are a typical product of the reintegration of Czechoslovak architecture into the international architectural debate after the collapse of the neoclassical socialist realism. They were mostly designed as a part of new urban structures in the wider center or in immediate contact with the historical core of the cities. Let us mention, for example, the House of Culture Družba in Levice. Then in the east of Slovakia, the House of Culture in Humenné, all the works of high architectural quality by architects who are not well known. They were not among the icons promoted in majority of the literature. Another excellent example is the house of the trade union movement in Košice. Miloš Horvat, wonderful architect, created this house. Today it was turned into a shopping mall. And for Prague audience, Municipal Cultural Center in Velký Krtiš, which has been done under the aegis of Karel Prager, the architect who has built this very building in which we sit. So his relation to this project was found in an archive recently. Responsible architect Karel Prager. He's not Vladimir, my apology. The realizations of the 1970s and the first half of 1980s had a different character. They were made after the introduction of a federation in Czechoslovak Republic. They had big volumes and expressive monumental forms. They often entered the immediate centers of towns where they contrasted with the original historic buildings. The most impressive works of this kind include the House of Culture in Trnava that you can see on the slide. It is in the very center of the core of Trnava. Another example is the community house in Dunajská Streda in the very center of the small South Slovakia town. It was very successful. It has been replicated in some other Slovak cities. Or the House of Culture in Spišská Nová Ves, another modernist disruptor. But the most famous and the largest of all Slovak cultural and social institutions is the House of Trade Unions, Technology and Culture in Bratislava.
Zábere.
It is important to recall that the construction of public facilities for this typology, that is, facilities for culture and education of the broad layers of population, was not the domain of the communist bloc. On the contrary, cultural and social facilities, including their architectural forms, were an important part of the cultural policy of states on both sides of the Iron Curtain. They also received attention in Western European democracies, where hundreds of similar facilities were built in the 50s and 1970s as a part of the welfare state policy. In Slovakia, the largest houses of culture were built at a time when the redevelopment of the central part of cities was at its peak. However, this trend was not only a consequence of ideological pressure of the communist regime and its disrespect for the bourgeois architectural heritage. To a large extent, It was promoted by architects, experts, urban planners. They relied on the Athens Charter, which in relation to monuments was clearly in favor of cleansing the historical cores of cities and of inferior structures. At the same time, they responded to the post-war notion of the urban center, the focus of social life. The heart of the city was articulated by the participants in the 1951 Siam in Hodesdan, entitled The Heart of the City. In practice, however, a sighting of new civic amenities in the centers of settlements was meant the disruption of the traditional urban fabric, often right in the historic core. At the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, when the new town or zone plans were being drawn up and new principles for conservation areas were being defined, works of modernist architecture, even if they were cultural buildings, were in most cases evaluated as intrusive objects. And this is still the case today in the relevant documents. This is despite the fact that already in the conclusions of the conference, values and perspectives for the protection of architecture and urban structures in the 1950s and 1960s, organized by the Monument Office of the Slovak Republic in the year 2008. It was literally written about the need to protect this part of architectural heritage. In practice, the situation is different. Even the magnificent house of art in Piešťany, a magnificent work of Slovak brutalist by Ferdinand Milučka, received legislative protection and declaration as a national cultural monument only this year, after big effort of architects and architectural historians from Docomomo Slovakia and local activists. The importance of protecting all layers of the historic urban landscape is also clearly stated in the 2011 UNESCO Declaration on Historic Urban Landscapes. The need to recognize and understand what qualities and characteristics modernism has brought in comparison to and in addition to older monuments of the city, and which need to be explained, adapted and enhanced to the maximum, was recently pointed out by the French architect Jean-Philippe Vassal, winner of the Pritzker Architecture Prize of 2021. Dozens of cultural and social buildings were sold off in Slovakia in the first decades after the Velvet Revolution. Most of the original owners of the houses of culture, be it the state or the city or trade unions, found themselves in financial distress after 1989 under the market pressure. This caused them to be neglected, inappropriately used, or sold off to private entities. The fact that almost all the buildings sold off were those that had been built during the socialist Czechoslovakia can be seen as a symbolic cleansing of Slovak society of the communist ideology. However, the change in the architectural and urban planning paradigm that began to manifest itself in Slovakia at the turn of the 70s and 80s also played a role in this process. I got lost in my papers now, but I'm back. The postmodernist notion of a return to traditional historical forms in city planning and to universally understandable means of architectural expression manifested itself in a radical rejection of modernism and its architectural and urban heritage. In the post-socialist countries, this denial of modernism culminated after 1989. It was combined with the rejection of authoritarianism and the global trend towards economic neoliberalism. It is thus clear that the desire to deal with the past, but also with global social trends, plays a significant role in the divestment of property that carried negative connotations associated with communist ideology. These were most ill-considered and unfortunate steps. In private hands, a lot of high-quality modern architecture, which could have formed the basis for future development, found itself in private hands. Let us mention the House of Culture in Banská Bystrica. This is another construction, Slovak brutalism, new town center in Banská Bystrica, and this architecture is suffering from problematic ownership relations. A similar case is the House of Culture in Spišská Nová Ves, where the city owns about a third of the property, but the rest is in the hands of a few private owners, which means that it cannot be used and maintained properly. In Trnava, the House of Culture is owned by a private entity as well, which uses it contrary to its original mission and spatial conditions, and has even planned its conversion into a collective garage, and this construction is in the very center of Trnava. An exceptional case of the dynamics and consequences of the social and economic transformation taking place over the last 3 decades is the capital of Bratislava, which was the first to be exposed to the pressure of the capital. Among the first to fall into private hands was the area of Park of Culture and Leisure in the railway station area. The sale of the land under it was approved by the City Council in June 2005. Years of non-transparent manipulation and buildings followed, accompanied by resistance of active citizens, including suggestions to declare the area a national cultural monument, which unfortunately didn't happen. So it was removed in 2016. A similar fate befell the city amphitheater by Stefan Svetko, Boris Jadoň, and after the City Council approved its transfer into private hands, the building burned down and the developer built a commercial housing development in its place. The complex of the former House of Trade Unions, Technology and Culture underwent the same process. It came into private hands only in 2017 after the capital city and the municipal district unsuccessfully tried to buy it from the Unified Property Fund, which manages the property of the former trade unions. This was followed by a process of gradual emptying, as it is shown on the photographs, and degradation of the building, which culminated in the announcement of its demolition. It was sold in 2017 and demolished. Demolition work began in January 2022 after 2 years' resistance and protests by professional and lay public. 11,000 signatures on a petition to preserve the house didn't prevent its destruction. The destruction of all of these buildings in question was accompanied by the same arguments about their being obsolete and unable to meet current current operational requirement. The well-known strategy of deliberate non-maintenance and controlled dilapidation was also applied to all of them, followed by the proposal to demolish them and build something else. According to the American heritage theorist Jorge Otero Palos, there is another important reason behind their destruction: the deregulation of the market economy. This, he argues, initially only made it impossible to practice this kind of socially engaged architecture, but now it is even removing the evidence that such architecture ever existed, as the heritage falls victim to developer pressures to demolish it. At the heart of the problem, then, may be precisely the political will of today's elites to erase the architecture of modernism because of its ability to evoke memories of the legacy of the welfare state. As for Jürgen Habermas, puts in his text Questions and Counter Questions, quote, if aesthetic experience is incorporated into the context of individual life histories, if it is used to illuminate the situation and clarify individual life problems, it communicates all of its impulses to the collective form of life. Then the art enters into a language game that is no longer aesthetic criticism, but belongs to everyday communicative practice. It is therefore crucial to extend the field of conservation beyond the technical restoration of buildings and to interpret the heritage of modern architecture and urbanism in all its complexity. More than ever, our aim should be to explore and explain the value of modern concepts, including their social contribution. It is necessary to clarify their impact on local communities and to make them comprehensible to the public. This was the motivation behind the preparation of the book that chronicles the origin, existence, and demise of the Trade Union House in Bratislava. We believe that this is not only an obituary, but also a tool that will help to bring the architecture of modernism into the language game that is part of everyday communicative practice. We have to gain the important stakeholders and players. We succeeded here. The Black Holes Černé díry Association promotes the architectural heritage of the 20th century, and they approach almost all Slovak population. They've issued this book and they subsidized the research published in this book. The book will be available towards the end of the month. So not an obituary, but an inspiration about a language game on communicative practice.